I pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Millfield Community Center, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary as I stared at the familiar red brick building where my family had gathered for reunions since I was 8 years old. The same faded blue banner hung between two oak trees reading "Welcome Wilson Family Reunion 2024, in cheerful letters that felt mocking given my current state of mind. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one more time, smoothing down my navy blazer and adjusting the simple pearl earrings my grandmother had left me. Professional but not too formal, I had told myself when getting dressed that morning, knowing that anything too polished would invite comments about how I was putting on airs or trying too hard to impress people. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The sounds of laughter and conversation drifted across the parking lot, punctuated by the occasional squeal of children playing on the nearby playground. I could see clusters of relatives through the large windows of the community center, some seated at long tables covered in checkered tablecloths, others standing around with paper plates and red Solo cups. My stomach churned with a familiar mixture of dread and obligation. Every year I told myself I wouldn't come, and every year I found myself driving the 3 hours from Columbus back to this small town where everyone still saw me as the girl who couldn't quite figure out her life. I took a deep breath and stepped out of my Honda Civic, the late afternoon sun warming my face as I walked toward the entrance. The automatic doors whooshed open, releasing a wave of air conditioning mixed with the smell of barbecue and potato salad. The community center's main hall stretched before me, decorated with red, white, and blue streamers left over from the 4th of July celebration the week before. Round tables filled the space, each one surrounded by folding chairs that had seen better days, and a long buffet table against the far wall groaned under the weight of casserole dishes, sandwich platters, and homemade desserts. My Aunt Carol spotted me first, waving enthusiastically from a table near the windows, where she sat with my Uncle Tom and several cousins I hadn't seen in 2 years. Her bleached blonde hair was teased higher than physics should have allowed, and she wore a bright pink t-shirt that declared her to be "World's Best Grandma" in glittering letters. I forced a smile and waved back, already dreading the inevitable interrogation about my love life and career prospects that would begin the moment I approached their table. But before I could navigate the maze of relatives, I heard the voice that never failed to make my shoulders tense. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," my father called out from across the room, his tone carrying just enough edge to silence the conversations at nearby tables. Robert Wilson stood near the dessert table, a paper plate loaded with my aunt's famous chocolate cake in one hand and a can of Budweiser in the other. At 62, he still carried himself with the confident posture of someone who had spent 30 years managing a successful auto parts store, his gray hair neatly combed and his polo shirt tucked into khaki pants with military precision. I walked toward him, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. "Hi, Dad. Good to see you too." The sarcasm in my voice was barely contained, but years of family gatherings had taught me to keep my reactions measured. Getting defensive or emotional would only prove his point that I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too everything that he found disappointing about me. He looked me up and down with the critical eye of someone examining a car engine that wasn't running quite right. "That outfit cost more than most people around here make in a week, I'd bet. Must be nice having one of those fancy government jobs where you don't have to do real work." The comment stung, not because it was true, but because it revealed how little he understood about what I actually did. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. For the past 8 years, I had worked my way up through various roles in state government, from legislative aide to policy analyst to chief of staff for a state senator. But in my father's mind, anything that didn't involve physical labor or direct sales was somehow suspect. My mother appeared at his elbow, as if summoned by the tension in his voice. Linda Wilson had perfected the art of smoothing over her husband's rough edges over 4 decades of marriage, and she slipped her arm through his with practiced ease. "Ella, sweetheart, you look wonderful," she said, though her eyes held a plea for me not to escalate whatever confrontation was brewing. "Come sit with us. Your cousin Jennifer just got engaged, and we're all dying to hear about the wedding plans." The redirect was obvious and familiar, but I allowed myself to be guided toward the table where my extended family had gathered. Jennifer sat beaming beside her fiancé, a soft-spoken accountant named Derek, who worked for one of the larger firms in Toledo. She held out her left hand to show off a modest diamond ring that caught the fluorescent lighting as she turned it back and forth. "We're thinking about a spring wedding," she gushed, launching into detailed descriptions of venue options and color schemes, while the older women at the table offered advice and shared stories of their own wedding preparations. I settled into an empty folding chair and tried to look interested, but my mind wandered as the conversation flowed around me. This was always how it went at family gatherings. The married cousins discussed their children's achievements. The unmarried ones shared updates about their dating lives or career advancement in traditional fields, and I sat quietly knowing that nothing in my life would translate well to this audience. How could I explain that I had spent the past 2 years developing policy frameworks for rural economic development, or that I had been working 18-hour days for the past 6 months on a campaign that could change the direction of our entire state? My brother Michael chose that moment to join our table, pulling up a chair beside Jennifer and immediately commanding attention with his presence. At 35, 2 years older than me, Michael had followed exactly the path our parents had envisioned for both their children. He had married his college girlfriend the year after graduation, taken over Dad's auto parts business when our father decided to semi-retire, and produced 2 adorable children who called our parents Grammy and Pops with appropriate frequency. He wore his success easily, from his confident smile to his expensive watch to the way he could discuss profit margins and inventory management with the same enthusiasm other people reserved for their hobbies. "Ella!" he exclaimed, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "I was hoping you'd make it. Sarah wanted to come, but little Tommy has a soccer tournament this weekend, and you know how that goes." His wife's absence wasn't particularly surprising, since she had never seemed entirely comfortable at these family gatherings, preferring to send her regrets along with a casserole dish and promises to catch up soon. "Dad was just telling me about your latest job change. Something with the state legislature?" The question was innocent enough, but it highlighted the fundamental disconnect between my life and my family's understanding of it. To them, my career appeared to be a series of random position changes, rather than a deliberate progression toward larger goals. They saw instability where I saw strategic advancement, uncertainty where I had found my calling. "I've been working as Chief of Staff for Senator Martinez," I explained, knowing the title would mean little to most of the people at the table. "It's been challenging but rewarding work." My father snorted from his position at the head of the table. "Chief of Staff sounds fancy, but what does it actually pay?" "Because I can tell you right now that if you'd taken that management position at the regional bank 3 years ago like I suggested, you'd be making twice whatever the state's paying you, plus benefits that actually mean something." The comment landed like a physical blow, not because of the financial comparison, but because of the dismissive tone that reduced years of purposeful work to a series of poor financial decisions. I felt heat rise in my cheeks and took a deliberate sip of my iced tea to buy myself time before responding. "It's not always about the money, Dad. Some of us find value in work that serves a larger purpose." "Larger purpose," he repeated, shaking his head with the weary expression of someone who had heard this argument before and found it wanting. "You know what serves a larger purpose? Providing for a family. Building something that lasts. Creating jobs for other people instead of shuffling papers around and pretending it matters." His voice was getting louder, drawing attention from neighboring tables where other family members were beginning to turn and listen to our exchange. Uncle Tom, clearly sensing the rising tension, attempted to lighten the mood with a joke about politicians, but my father was just getting started. "I've watched you for 10 years now, jumping from one government job to another, always chasing some dream that never seems to materialize into anything concrete. Meanwhile, your brother built a business, bought a house, raised a family. He contributed something real to his community." The implicit comparison hung in the air like smoke from a barbecue grill, acrid and impossible to ignore. This was the fundamental narrative that had shaped every family gathering for the past decade. Michael as the success story, the son who had fulfilled his potential and justified his parents' investment, while I remained the cautionary tale. The daughter whose intelligence and education had somehow failed to translate into the kind of conventional achievements they could understand and celebrate. Jennifer's fiancé Derek looked deeply uncomfortable, studying his potato salad with the intensity of someone trying to disappear into the furniture. My cousin Jennifer herself kept glancing between my father and me as though watching a tennis match, her engagement ring forgotten as the family drama unfolded. My mother made small, soothing sounds and reached across the table to pat my hand, but she didn't contradict my father or defend my choices, and her silence felt like its own form of judgment. "I'm 33 years old, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "I think I'm capable of making my own decisions about my career and my life. Not everyone defines success the same way you do." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest in a gesture that broadcast his complete lack of conviction in my argument. "Success isn't subjective, Ella. Success is measurable. It's a house, a family, financial security, respect in your community. It's building something that will outlast you. What have you built? What do you have to show for all this education and all these fancy job titles?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt the weight of every family gathering where I had been found wanting, every conversation where my accomplishments had been diminished or dismissed, every moment when I had been made to feel like an outsider in my own family. The irony was almost unbearable. Sitting there being lectured about contribution and achievement when I carried a secret that would have stunned everyone at that table into silence. But I couldn't tell them. Not yet. The election results wouldn't be officially announced until Monday morning, and even though the outcome was certain, even though I had spent the past week meeting with transition teams and planning the next phase of my career, I was bound by protocol and tradition to wait for the formal declaration. So I sat there, absorbing my father's criticism and my family's sympathetic looks, knowing that in 3 days everything would change, but unable to defend myself with the truth that would have vindicated every choice I had made. The conversation gradually shifted away from my perceived failures as other relatives joined the table and introduced new topics, but the damage was done. I picked at my food and contributed minimally to discussions about local news and family updates, feeling like a fraud among people who thought they knew me but understood nothing about the life I had actually built. My father's words echoed in my mind, not because I believed them, but because they represented a judgment I had been fighting against my entire adult life. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself counting the minutes until I could politely excuse myself and begin the drive back to Columbus, back to the world where my work mattered and my contributions were recognized and valued. But first, I had to endure the rest of this gathering, smile through the small talk, and pretend that my father's assessment of my life hadn't cut as deeply as it had. The hardest part wasn't the criticism itself, but the knowledge that he genuinely believed he was right, that he saw my career in public service as a waste of potential rather than the fulfillment of it. After my father's stinging assessment of my life choices, the afternoon stretched ahead like an endurance test. I excused myself from the table under the pretense of helping with dessert preparation, though truthfully I needed space to collect myself before I said something I would regret. The community center's small kitchen bustled with activity as several aunts orchestrated the distribution of homemade pies, cookies, and cakes that would cap off our family feast. My Aunt Carol immediately pulled me into service, handing me a stack of paper plates while she surveyed the dessert offerings with the strategic eye of a general planning a campaign. "Your grandmother's apple pie recipe turned out perfectly this year," she announced, cutting generous slices of a golden-crusted pie that filled the air with cinnamon and nutmeg. Though I still say she never wrote down the real measurements. I've been guessing at the spice ratios for 15 years. I arranged plates on a serving tray, grateful for the mindless task that gave my hands something to do while my mind processed the confrontation with my father. Carol chatted continuously as she worked, filling me in on family gossip and neighborhood drama with the enthusiasm of someone who viewed other people's business as personal entertainment. Normally, her running commentary annoyed me, but today it provided a welcome distraction from the knot of frustration in my stomach. "Did you see that Jennifer's ring?" Carol whispered conspiratorially, glancing toward the main hall where my cousin continued to display her engagement ring for anyone who would admire it. "Derek must have spent at least 3 months' salary on that diamond. Good for him, I say. A girl should have something substantial to show for her commitment. Not like that tiny chip your cousin Amy got when she married that electrician from Findlay." The comments struck me as typical of my family's approach to measuring success through material displays, but I nodded politely and continued arranging dessert plates. Through the serving window that connected the kitchen to the main hall, I could see my father holding court at our table, gesturing emphatically as he told what appeared to be a story about a difficult customer at his auto parts store. His audience of relatives nodded and laughed at appropriate intervals, clearly entertained by his animated storytelling. Michael had moved to join a group of male relatives near the beverage station, where they discussed golf handicaps and weekend fishing plans, with the casual camaraderie of men who shared similar life experiences. He fit seamlessly into their circle, contributing stories about his own recreational pursuits and offering recommendations for tackle shops and golf courses. Watching him, I felt a familiar pang of something that wasn't quite envy but wasn't entirely different either. It wasn't that I wanted his life, but I sometimes wondered what it would feel like to belong so effortlessly to the community where I had grown up. "Ella, sweetheart, you seem quiet today," observed my Aunt Helen as she joined us in the kitchen. Helen was my mother's younger sister, a retired school teacher who had always been gentler in her judgments than the rest of the family. She had never married, dedicating her career to education and her personal life to caring for their elderly parents until they passed. "Everything all right with you?" I appreciated her genuine concern, but wasn't sure how to articulate the complex emotions swirling around my father's criticism without revealing information I couldn't yet share. "Just tired," I said, which wasn't entirely untrue. The past 6 months had been exhausting in ways that went far beyond physical fatigue. "Work has been demanding lately." Helen nodded knowingly. "Government work always seems to come in waves, doesn't it? Either feast or famine." She had a better understanding of public sector employment than most of my relatives, having spent her career in public education. "I imagine election season keeps everyone especially busy." Her comment was more perceptive than she probably realized, and I felt a momentary urge to confide in her about the secret I was carrying. But even Helen, with her discretion and understanding, couldn't be trusted with information that could leak back to the rest of the family before the official announcement. Instead, I smiled and agreed that election cycles did indeed create additional workload demands. The kitchen crew finished their preparations and began carrying dessert trays into the main hall, where relatives were clearing dinner plates and resetting tables for the next phase of our gathering. I followed with a tray of paper plates and plastic forks, scanning the room for a quiet corner where I could sit and observe rather than participate. But before I could claim a seat at one of the smaller tables, my cousin Jennifer intercepted me with an excited expression. "Ella, I'm so glad you're here," she gushed, linking her arm through mine with the familiarity of someone who had grown up attending the same family gatherings. "I wanted to talk to you about something. Derek and I are thinking about having you in the wedding party, maybe as a bridesmaid. I know we haven't been super close lately, but you're family, and it would mean a lot to me." The invitation surprised me, partly because Jennifer and I had indeed drifted apart over the years, our lives taking increasingly different directions after high school. She had married young, focused on building a traditional domestic life, while I had pursued education and career advancement that took me away from our hometown. Our conversations at family gatherings had become increasingly superficial, touching on safe topics like weather and mutual acquaintances, while avoiding the deeper questions about life choices and priorities. "That's very sweet of you to think of me," I replied carefully, uncertain how to respond to an invitation that felt generous but also complicated. "When are you planning the wedding?" The question bought me time while I considered how to navigate this unexpected development. "Next spring," Jennifer said, her eyes lighting up as she launched into detailed descriptions of venue options and seasonal considerations. "We're thinking maybe April or May, when the weather's nice but not too hot. Derek's sister is going to be my maid of honor, and I want 2 other bridesmaids to balance out his groomsmen. I already asked my college roommate, and you would be perfect for the 3rd spot." As she spoke, I became increasingly aware that her invitation was motivated less by genuine closeness than by practical considerations of matching wedding party numbers and maintaining family harmony. But I also recognized the gesture as an attempt to bridge the gap that had grown between us, and I appreciated her effort, even if the foundation felt somewhat hollow. "I'm honored that you'd think of me," I said diplomatically. "Can I think about it?" My work schedule has been unpredictable lately, and I want to make sure I can commit fully before saying yes. This was true enough, though the unpredictability I was referring to had nothing to do with my current position and everything to do with the dramatic career change that would soon reshape my entire life. Jennifer nodded enthusiastically, clearly interpreting my request for time as a positive sign. Of course, there's no rush. I just wanted to put it on your radar so you could start thinking about it. It would be such a special way to bring our family together. Before I could respond, the conversation was interrupted by my Uncle Tom tapping a fork against his beer bottle to call for attention. The room gradually quieted as relatives turned toward him, anticipating one of the informal speeches that traditionally marked our family reunions. Tom was my father's older brother, a retired factory supervisor who had become the unofficial family patriarch after their father's death 5 years earlier. If I could have everyone's attention for just a minute, Tom announced, his voice carrying easily across the room despite his age. I want to take a moment to appreciate having everyone together again this year. I know it gets harder every summer to coordinate schedules and travel, but looking around this room, I'm reminded of why we make the effort. He paused to survey the assembled relatives, his gaze lingering on the youngest generation of children, who were fidgeting in their chairs but trying to appear attentive. Family is what matters most in this world. Not jobs, not money, not fancy degrees or big city living. Family, the people who knew you before you, were anybody special, and who'll still love you after the world forgets your name. The speech was classic Uncle Tom, mixing genuine sentiment with subtle criticism of those family members who had strayed too far from traditional values. I felt the familiar sting of being indirectly referenced, one of those relatives who had chosen education and career advancement over remaining close to home and family. His words weren't meant to be cruel, but they carried an implicit judgment about priorities and loyalties that had shaped family conversations for years. So I want to raise a toast, Tom continued, lifting his beer bottle, to the Wilson family, to tradition, to staying true to what matters most. The room responded with a chorus of agreement, bottles and glasses raised in a gesture of unity that somehow managed to make me feel more isolated than before. As the toast concluded and conversations resumed, I noticed my father watching me from across the room with an expression that seemed to combine disappointment with something approaching pity. He had heard Uncle Tom's speech as validation of his own criticism earlier, confirmation that my career choices represented a fundamental misunderstanding of life's priorities. The look he gave me suggested he viewed me as someone who had lost her way, sacrificing the important things for empty achievements that impressed no one who mattered. My mother approached during the post-toast chaos, carrying 2 pieces of my grandmother's apple pie on paper plates. I thought you might want some dessert, she said, offering me one of the plates. You barely touched your dinner. Her observation was accurate but gentle, delivered with the concern of someone who had spent decades reading my moods and recognizing when I was struggling. Thanks, Mom. I accepted the pie gratefully, realizing I was actually hungry despite the emotional turmoil of the afternoon. Uncle Tom's speech was nice, I added, though we both knew the comment carried layers of meaning beyond its surface politeness. Linda Wilson had perfected the art of navigating family dynamics without taking explicit sides, a skill developed through years of mediating between her husband's strong opinions and her children's independent streaks. He means well, she said diplomatically. Sometimes I think he forgets that families can stay close even when people take different paths. Her comment was as close to a defense of my choices as she was likely to offer in public, and I appreciated the subtle support even as I wished she felt comfortable being more direct. But I understood the position she was in, caught between loyalty to her husband and love for her daughter, trying to maintain peace while validating everyone's perspectives. We ate our pie in companionable silence, watching the organized chaos of a large family gathering unfold around us. Children chased each other between tables, while adults clustered in conversation groups that shifted and reformed like weather patterns. My cousin Jennifer had returned to displaying her engagement ring and discussing wedding plans with a circle of female relatives who offered advice based on their own matrimonial experiences. The scene was warmly familiar and deeply alienating simultaneously. These were people who had known me my entire life, who had celebrated my achievements in school and college, who had watched me grow from a shy child into an accomplished adult. But somewhere along the way, the distance created by my career choices and geographic moves had transformed their knowledge of me into assumptions that no longer matched reality. Did I ever tell you about the time your great-grandmother Wilson decided to run for school board? My mother asked suddenly, apparently following her own train of thought. This would have been back in the 1950s, when women just didn't do that sort of thing in small towns like this one. I shook my head, intrigued by this family story I had never heard. What happened? Well, she saw some problems with how the schools were being managed, and she decided someone needed to speak up. Your great-grandfather was mortified, told her it wasn't appropriate for a woman to get involved in public affairs, that people would think she was overstepping her bounds. Linda smiled at the memory, her voice taking on the warm tone she reserved for stories about family members she had admired. But she ran anyway, lost the election, but not by much. And you know what happened 2 years later? She ran again, I guessed. She ran again, and she won. Served on that school board for 12 years, and by the time she finished, nobody could remember why they had thought it was strange for a woman to hold that position. My mother's eyes met mine across the small table where we sat. Sometimes the most important thing isn't whether people understand your choices right away. Sometimes it's about being patient while they catch up. The story felt like a deliberate gift, a reminder that challenging family expectations wasn't a new phenomenon in our lineage, but it also highlighted how much courage it must have taken for my great-grandmother to persist in the face of disapproval, and how long the process of changing minds could take. I wondered if I had that kind of patience, or if the recognition I craved would need to come from outside the family before it could be acknowledged within it. As the afternoon progressed, the reunion began to take on the familiar rhythm of these annual gatherings. The older generation settled into comfortable chairs to share stories about deceased relatives and neighborhood changes, while the middle generation discussed mortgages and children's activities with the focused intensity of people comparing notes on shared challenges. The youngest generation, those who had recently graduated from college or were just starting their careers, clustered together near the beverage station, their conversations a mixture of optimism and uncertainty about the future. I found myself floating between groups without fully belonging to any of them, too young for the nostalgic reminiscing of my parents' generation, but too removed from traditional life milestones to contribute meaningfully to discussions about marriage and child-rearing. My work experiences were too specialized for general consumption, and my geographic distance from the family meant I lacked current knowledge about local happenings that formed the basis of much family conversation. The isolation became more pronounced when my cousin Derek, Jennifer's fiancé, approached me during a lull in the festivities. He seemed genuinely interested in learning more about what I did for work, perhaps recognizing a fellow outsider in the family dynamic. As an accountant from Toledo, he understood professional life in ways that many of my relatives didn't, and his questions about state government operations were informed and thoughtful. "It must be fascinating work," he said as I explained some of the policy development processes I had been involved with. "I imagine you get to see how decisions made at the state level actually impact communities like this one." His observation was perceptive, and I appreciated having someone who could understand the broader significance of administrative work that often appeared abstract to people outside government. But before I could elaborate on his point, my father appeared beside us with the timing of someone who had been monitoring our conversation. "Derek, you don't want to get Ella started on politics," he said with forced joviality. "She'll talk your ear off about regulations and committees and all that bureaucratic nonsense that doesn't amount to anything real." The dismissal was delivered with a smile, but its impact was immediate and devastating. In one casual comment, my father had reduced years of meaningful work to bureaucratic nonsense, while simultaneously positioning me as someone whose passionate interests were burdensome to others. Derek looked uncomfortable, clearly uncertain how to respond to this family dynamic playing out in front of him. "Actually, I find it quite interesting," Derek said diplomatically. "It's important work." His attempt to redirect the conversation was well-intentioned, but only seemed to reinforce my father's point about people being too polite to express their real opinions about my career choices. My father chuckled and clapped Derek on the shoulder with the familiarity of someone welcoming him into the family fold. "You're a good man, Derek. But trust me, After you've been around government people for a while, you realize they're all just pushing papers around and justifying their paychecks. The real work gets done in the private sector, by people who actually produce something valuable. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with my father expounding on his theories about government inefficiency, while Derek nodded politely, and I stood silently fuming. Each comment felt like another layer of dismissal, another confirmation that my father viewed my entire career as an elaborate form of unemployment compensation. The most frustrating part was knowing that I couldn't defend myself without revealing information that would transform this entire gathering, but which remained off-limits for another 48 hours. Eventually, Derek excused himself to rejoin Jennifer, leaving me alone with my father in what felt like an increasingly hostile environment. The community center's air conditioning struggled against the heat generated by dozens of people in a confined space, and the noise level had risen as conversations became more animated and alcohol loosened tongues. I felt trapped between the obligation to remain until the gathering officially concluded and the desperate desire to escape before another confrontation erupted. "You know what your problem is, Ella?" my father said, apparently deciding that our temporary privacy was an opportunity for additional commentary on my life choices. "You think being smart makes you better than everyone else. You've got all these fancy degrees and impressive-sounding job titles, but you've forgotten where you come from and what actually matters." His assessment stung because it was simultaneously completely wrong and partially accurate. I didn't think I was better than my family, but I had grown increasingly frustrated with their inability to understand or value the work I did. And while I hadn't forgotten where I came from, I had certainly moved beyond the narrow definitions of success that characterized my hometown. The tension between honoring my roots and pursuing my aspirations had become one of the defining challenges of my adult life. "I've never said I was better than anyone," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm despite the anger building in my chest. "I've just made different choices about how to use my education and abilities. Not everyone has to follow the same path to have a meaningful life." He shook his head with the weary expression of someone who had heard this argument before and found it wanting. "There's nothing meaningful about pushing papers around government offices and pretending it makes a difference. You want to make a difference? Teach school like your Aunt Helen did. Start a business that creates jobs. Raise children who'll contribute to their communities. Do something real instead of just talking about doing something important." The irony was almost unbearable, standing there being lectured about contribution and impact by someone who had no idea that in less than 3 days, I would be announcing my election to the highest office in our state government. But the enforced silence made his criticism feel even more painful, like being forced to accept blame for failures that didn't exist while being unable to present evidence of actual achievements. As the afternoon wore on and the reunion began to wind down, I realized that nothing had changed in the fundamental dynamic between my father and me. If anything, the confrontation had reinforced our respective positions and deepened the sense of misunderstanding that had characterized our relationship for years. He remained convinced that my career represented a waste of potential and a rejection of family values, while I felt increasingly isolated from people who should have been my strongest supporters. The recognition I craved, the validation that my choices had led to meaningful achievements, would have to come from other sources. In 3 days, when the election results were officially announced, my father would learn, along with everyone else, that his failure of a daughter had been chosen by the voters of our state to serve as their next governor. But even that dramatic revelation might not bridge the gap that had grown between us, might not heal the wounds inflicted by years of dismissal and disappointment. As families began gathering their children and collecting casserole dishes to take home, I knew that this reunion would be remembered as another missed opportunity for connection, another confirmation that the distance between my father's expectations and my reality had become too great to cross with simple explanations or heartfelt conversations. The next time we gathered, everything would be different, but whether that difference would bring us closer together or drive us further apart remained to be seen. The community center had begun to empty as families with young children made their departures, but a core group of relatives remained for what had become an informal tradition of extending the reunion into the early evening hours. The cleanup crew, consisting mostly of the women in my family, had efficiently cleared tables and packed leftover food into containers that would be distributed among various households. I found myself relegated to folding chairs and stacking them against the wall, a task that kept my hands busy while my mind continued to process the emotional bruising of the afternoon. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I discreetly checked the screen to find a text message from Rebecca Martinez, my campaign manager and closest confidant throughout the grueling election process. The message was brief, but loaded with significance. Final precinct numbers confirmed. Margin even larger than projected. Press conference still set for Monday 9 a.m. How are you holding up? I glanced around to ensure no family members were watching before typing a quick response. Family reunion. Can't talk. Will call tonight. The exchange took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like lifting a window shade to let sunlight into a dark room. Somewhere beyond this small-town community center, beyond the narrow judgments and dismissive comments, an entire state was preparing to learn that I would be their next governor. The contrast between my family's perception of my failures and the reality of my achievements had never felt more stark. Ella? Are you feeling all right? My Aunt Helen asked, approaching with a concerned expression. You look a bit pale, sweetheart. Her gentle attention was a welcome relief from the criticism that had dominated most of my interactions, and I realized that my effort to maintain composure might not have been as successful as I had hoped. Just tired, I replied, which remained partially true despite the energizing effect of Rebecca's message. It's been a long day. Helen nodded understandingly and handed me a paper bag filled with leftover cookies, a gesture that reminded me why she had always been my favorite relative despite our infrequent contact. Take these with you for the drive home, she said. And Ella, don't let your father's comments get to you too much. He means well, but he sometimes forgets that there are many ways to build a meaningful life. Her words were carefully chosen to avoid direct criticism of her brother-in-law while still offering support, and I appreciated both her diplomacy and her insight. Before I could respond, the community center's main door opened to admit a group of people who clearly weren't part of our family gathering. A woman in her 50s entered first, her silver hair styled in a professional bob and her navy blazer suggesting someone accustomed to formal occasions. Behind her came 3 men in business attire, their presence immediately shifting the energy in the room as conversations quieted and heads turned to assess these unexpected arrivals. I recognized the woman immediately, though it took a moment for my surprise to process into understanding. Patricia Williams had been the mayor of Millfield for 8 years, a position she had assumed after a career in regional planning that had taken her throughout Ohio before she returned to her hometown to serve in local government. We had never met personally, but I had followed her work from a distance and respected her reputation for effective leadership in challenging circumstances. I hope we're not interrupting, Mayor Williams said, addressing the room with the practiced ease of someone comfortable with public speaking. I was driving past and noticed the Wilson family reunion sign. I've been hoping for an opportunity to speak with one of your family members. Her gaze swept the assembled relatives before settling on me with unmistakable recognition. The silence that followed felt charged with curiosity and confusion. My family members exchanged glances, clearly uncertain why the mayor would have business with any of them. My father stepped forward with the automatic courtesy of someone accustomed to being the family spokesperson, his posture straightening as he prepared to represent the Wilson clan in whatever official matter had brought the mayor to our gathering. Mayor Williams, he said with formal politeness. I'm Robert Wilson. What can we do for you? His tone carried the slight defensiveness of someone uncertain whether this unexpected visit represented good news or potential trouble, but determined to handle whatever situation had arisen with appropriate dignity. Mayor Williams smiled warmly but shook her head. Actually, Mr. Wilson, I was hoping to speak with your daughter Ella, if she has a few minutes, that is. The redirect caught my father off guard, his confident expression faltering as he processed the unexpected focus on me rather than himself or Michael as the obvious family leaders. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward me with varying degrees of surprise, confusion, and curiosity. I felt heat rise in my cheeks as I struggled to understand why Mayor Williams would seek me out at a family gathering, particularly when our paths had never crossed in any official capacity. The timing seemed impossibly coincidental, arriving just as I was processing Rebecca's message about our election victory. Of course, I managed to say, stepping forward with as much composure as I could muster. Though I'm not sure what I can help you with. The disclaimer was automatic, a protective response learned through years of political training, but it felt hollow, given the certainty that this visit was somehow connected to information that remained officially confidential. Perhaps we could step outside for a moment, Mayor Williams suggested, gesturing toward the exit. It's such a beautiful evening, and what I have to discuss might be better suited to a more private conversation. Her diplomatic phrasing suggested she understood the delicate nature of whatever had brought her here, though I remained mystified about how she had even known where to find me. I followed her toward the door, acutely aware of my family's confused stares and whispered speculation. Through the corner of my eye, I saw my father's bewildered expression as he tried to process why a mayor would seek out his unsuccessful daughter for a private conversation. Michael looked equally puzzled, his usual confidence shaken by this development that didn't fit his understanding of family dynamics or local politics. The evening air outside provided a welcome contrast to the stuffy atmosphere of the community center, and I breathed deeply as we walked toward a quiet area near the playground where children's swings moved gently in the breeze. Mayor Williams waited until we were clearly out of earshot before speaking, her expression growing more serious as she prepared to address whatever had brought her here. "Ms. Wilson," she began, then paused and smiled. Or should I say Governor-elect Wilson? The title hit me like a physical impact, simultaneously thrilling and terrifying in its implications. My carefully maintained composure finally cracked as I struggled to understand how she could possibly know information that wouldn't be publicly announced for 2 more days. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I'm not sure what you mean." The denial was reflexive, trained into me through months of campaign discipline about maintaining message control and avoiding premature announcements. But Mayor Williams's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled by my attempt at ignorance. "My apologies for the dramatic approach," she said gently. "I probably should have called first, but I wanted to congratulate you personally, and when I learned you were in town for your family reunion, it seemed like too good an opportunity to pass up." She paused, studying my expression with the practiced eye of someone skilled at reading political situations. "I hope I haven't overstepped by coming here." The relief of having someone acknowledge what I couldn't yet publicly claim was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a new wave of anxiety about how this information had reached her, and who else might be aware of results that were supposed to remain confidential until Monday morning. "How did you know?" I asked, abandoning any pretense of ignorance now that she had clearly demonstrated her knowledge. "County clerk networks are efficient," she replied with a knowing smile. "Unofficial results have been circulating among local officials since this morning, though obviously nothing can be announced until the formal certification process concludes. But I wanted to reach out personally because your victory represents something significant for those of us who believe in public service as a noble calling." Her words carried an emotional weight that caught me off guard, reminding me that the election results represented more than personal achievement. They were validation of an approach to governance that prioritized long-term public benefit over short-term political gain, a philosophy that had sometimes made my campaign unconventional, but had ultimately resonated with voters across party lines. "Thank you," I said, my voice carrying more emotion than I had intended. "It's been surreal, keeping this quiet while waiting for Monday's announcement, especially today, with my family." I gestured toward the community center where I could see relatives through the windows, still clustered in animated conversation about the mayor's unexpected visit. Mayor Williams nodded understandingly. "Family dynamics can be complicated when your professional life takes unexpected turns. I remember when I first ran for mayor, my own parents couldn't understand why I would want to subject myself to public scrutiny when I had a perfectly good planning job that paid well and kept me out of controversial decisions." Her observation resonated deeply with my own experience of family members who viewed political careers as inherently unstable and potentially embarrassing. "It's difficult when the people closest to you don't understand the work you're passionate about," I admitted. "Sometimes I think they see my career choices as intentionally rejecting their values rather than pursuing my own calling." "That will change," Mayor Williams said with quiet confidence. "When I won my first election, my father told everyone in town that his daughter was the mayor, despite having spent months telling me I was wasting my time on a campaign that would only end in disappointment. Recognition has a way of shifting perspectives, even among the most skeptical family members. The conversation continued for several more minutes, as Mayor Williams shared insights about transitioning from campaign mode to governance, the challenges of building effective teams, and the importance of maintaining connections with local officials who would be crucial partners in implementing state-level initiatives. Her advice was practical and generous, offered with the understanding that successful governance required collaboration across jurisdictional boundaries. "I should let you get back to your family," she said eventually, glancing toward the community center where figures could be seen moving past the windows. "But I did want to extend an invitation. Once your victory is officially announced and the transition period begins, I'd love to host you here in Millfield for a community meeting. Give local residents a chance to share their concerns and priorities directly with their new governor." The invitation was both professionally valuable and personally meaningful, representing an opportunity to demonstrate state-level attention to small-town concerns, while also showing my family and hometown community that my work had genuine local relevance. "I would be honored," I replied. "My staff will be in touch once we begin scheduling public events." As we prepared to return to the community center, Mayor Williams paused with what appeared to be a moment of inspiration. "Actually, would you mind if I said a few words to your family gathering? Nothing about the election results, of course, but I think it would be appropriate for me to acknowledge your contributions to state government and express appreciation for your public service." The suggestion sent a jolt of nervous excitement through me, imagining my father's reaction to an official endorsement of my career from a respected local leader. "Are you sure that wouldn't be inappropriate, given the confidential nature of the election results?" I asked, wanting to ensure we didn't create any ethical complications. "Not at all," she assured me. "Your record of public service is a matter of public record, and it's entirely appropriate for local officials to recognize state government employees who have served with distinction. I'll be careful to keep my comments focused on your past achievements rather than future opportunities." We returned to the community center together, where our entrance immediately drew the attention of every remaining family member. The buzz of conversation that had filled the room during our absence died to complete silence as relatives studied Mayor Williams's expression for clues about the nature of her business with me. My father stood near the dessert table, his posture rigid with the tension of someone bracing for unexpected news. "I apologize for interrupting your family gathering," Mayor Williams announced to the room, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone comfortable addressing diverse audiences. "But I wanted to take a moment to recognize one of your family members for her outstanding service to our state." She paused, allowing suspense to build as confused glances ricocheted between relatives. "Ella Wilson has spent the past 8 years building a distinguished career in state government, working on policy initiatives that have had real impact on communities throughout Ohio. Her expertise in rural economic development has been instrumental in securing funding for infrastructure projects that benefit small towns like ours." The mayor's voice carried genuine admiration as she continued her impromptu speech. I watched my family's faces transform as Mayor Williams spoke, confusion giving way to surprise and something approaching awe. My father's expression was particularly fascinating to observe, cycling through disbelief, recognition, and what might have been the beginning of pride as he processed this unexpected perspective on my career. "Most recently," Mayor Williams continued, "Ella has been serving as Chief of Staff for Senator Martinez, a position that requires tremendous expertise in policy development and political strategy. She has earned a reputation among state officials as someone who combines analytical rigor with genuine commitment to public service." The description painted a picture of professional achievement that none of my family members had ever heard articulated so clearly. As mayor of Millfield, I've had the opportunity to work with many state government officials over the years, and I can tell you that Ella's reputation for competence and integrity precedes her wherever she goes. "You should be very proud to have such a dedicated public servant in your family." Mayor Williams concluded her remarks with a warm smile directed toward my parents, who appeared to be struggling to reconcile this glowing assessment with their previous understanding of my career. The silence that followed her speech felt charged with shifted energy, as though the fundamental assumptions underlying our family dynamics had been suddenly called into question. My father cleared his throat with the awkward timing of someone uncertain how to respond to information that contradicted his firmly held beliefs. "Well," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment, We had no idea that Ella's work was so well regarded. She's always been modest about her achievements. The comment was clearly an attempt to save face while acknowledging that his previous criticism might have been based on incomplete information. Mayor Williams smiled graciously. That's the mark of a true professional. The most effective public servants are often the least likely to promote their own accomplishments. Her diplomatic response allowed my father to retreat from his earlier position without losing dignity, while simultaneously reinforcing the value of the work he had been dismissing. Mayor Williams, my mother interjected, finding her voice after the initial shock of this unexpected testimony. Would you care to join us for dessert? We have plenty, and it's the least we can offer after you've taken the time to visit our gathering. The invitation was clearly motivated by a desire to extend the conversation and perhaps learn more about this aspect of my life that had been revealed so dramatically. That's very kind, but I should be getting home, the mayor replied politely. My husband is grilling dinner, and I promise not to be late. She turned back to me with a professional smile. Ella, thank you for your time this evening. I look forward to continuing our conversation in the coming weeks. The formal tone of her farewell carried subtle implications that didn't escape the attention of my relatives, who exchanged meaningful glances as they tried to decode the suggestion of ongoing professional relationship between the mayor and me. As Mayor Williams headed toward the exit, accompanied by the men who had arrived with her and remained silently respectful throughout the exchange, I felt the weight of multiple family stares focused on me with new intensity. Ella, my cousin Jennifer said as soon as the mayor's group had departed. Why didn't you tell us that you were so important in state government? Mayor Williams made it sound like you're practically running things in Columbus. Her tone carried a mixture of excitement and reproach, as though she felt personally deceived by my failure to share this information. I've never claimed to be running anything, I replied carefully, still bound by the constraints of information I couldn't yet reveal. I just do my job and try to serve the public interest. Mayor Williams was being generous in her assessment. The deflection felt inadequate given the dramatic shift in family attention, but I remained committed to maintaining appropriate boundaries around confidential information. My father approached with an expression that I had never seen before, something between confusion and what might have been approaching respect. Ella, I think we need to have a serious conversation about your career. It's clear that your mother and I haven't understood the significance of your work. The admission was as close to an apology as he was likely to offer, but it represented a fundamental shift in his willingness to reconsider his assumptions. There's always more to learn about each other, I said diplomatically, trying to offer him an esquo tough toward revised understanding without requiring him to admit the full extent of his previous misjudgments. Public service can be difficult to explain because so much of the work happens behind the scenes. The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion I had experienced in years, as relatives peppered me with questions about my responsibilities, my colleagues, and my future plans. For the first time, they seemed genuinely curious about the substance of my work, rather than simply concerned about its implications for my personal life. The change in tone was remarkable, triggered entirely by external validation, from someone whose opinion they respected and trusted. But even as I appreciated this new interest in my professional life, I remained aware that their enthusiasm was prompted by Mayor Williams's endorsement, rather than by any deeper understanding of my actual achievements or motivations. The validation was welcome but also somewhat hollow, highlighting how much their perception of my worth remained tied to external recognition rather than internal conviction about my value as a family member and individual. As the evening continued and the community center gradually emptied, I found myself in the unusual position of being the center of positive family attention. Relatives who had spent years politely tolerating my career choices now wanted detailed explanations of policy development processes and insights into political strategy. The reversal was gratifying but also disorienting, leaving me uncertain whether this newfound respect would survive the inevitable return to normal family dynamics. The most significant change was in my father's demeanor, as he struggled to reconcile Mayor Williams's glowing assessment with his long-held belief that my career represented a waste of potential. He asked halting questions about my responsibilities and seemed genuinely surprised by the complexity and scope of the work I described. For the first time in years, he listened to my explanations without immediately redirecting the conversation toward criticism or alternative suggestions. As we finally prepared to leave the community center, my father approached me with the hesitant manner of someone venturing into unfamiliar territory. "Ella, I owe you an apology," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure our conversation remained private. "I've been critical of your choices without really understanding what you do or why it matters. Mayor Williams helped me see that I've been unfair." The apology was more than I had expected, but less than I needed, acknowledging his criticism without fully grappling with its impact or the assumptions that had motivated it. Still, it represented progress, a willingness to reconsider positions that had seemed permanently fixed. "Thank you for saying that, Dad," I replied. "I know my career path hasn't been easy to understand from the outside." "Maybe you could help me understand it better," he suggested, his voice carrying a humility I had rarely heard from him. "I'd like to learn more about what you do and why you think it's important." The request was tentative but genuine, offering a foundation for rebuilding our relationship on more solid ground. As I drove home toward Columbus that evening, my mind raced with the implications of Mayor Williams's unexpected visit and its dramatic impact on my family's perception of my career. In less than 48 hours, they would learn the full truth about my election victory, information that would complete the transformation begun by the mayor's endorsement. But even more significant than their eventual pride in my achievement was the possibility that we might finally begin to understand each other as adults, rather than as actors trapped in childhood roles that no longer fit our actual lives. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that comes after thunderstorms, and I woke in my Columbus apartment to find dozens of missed calls and text messages from reporters, colleagues, and political contacts across the state. The official announcement was still 3 hours away, but the political world had clearly awakened to rumors that were about to become reality. I silenced my phone and focused on the morning routine that had sustained me through months of campaigning, knowing that this would be the last quiet moment I would have for the foreseeable future. Rebecca arrived at my apartment at 7:30 sharp, carrying coffee and a stack of newspapers that would soon carry headlines about our victory. Her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of excitement as she reviewed the final details of our announcement strategy, checking and rechecking logistics that had been planned for weeks but somehow felt surreal now that the moment had arrived. "Channel 6 wants an exclusive interview right after the press conference," she reported, scrolling through her tablet with the efficiency of someone managing multiple complex schedules simultaneously. "And the governor wants to meet with you privately before the public transition begins. His office called 3 times since yesterday evening." The rapid-fire updates were familiar from our campaign work, but they carried new weight now that each decision would have statewide implications. I nodded absently, my mind still partially occupied with memories of the family reunion and the dramatic shift that had occurred when Mayor Williams appeared. The contrast between that gathering and this morning's political intensity felt like existing in 2 completely different worlds, and I wondered how my family was processing the intervening hours since learning about my previously unknown professional reputation. "There's something else," Rebecca said, her tone shifting to indicate news of particular significance. "Your father called the campaign office this morning. Left a message saying he wanted to know when and where the announcement would be and asking if family members could attend." The information surprised me, given that my parents had never shown interest in my political activities beyond expressing general concern about the stability and respectability of careers in public service. "What did you tell him?" I asked, uncertain how to navigate this unprecedented family interest in my professional life. Throughout the campaign, I had deliberately avoided involving my relatives in political activities, partly to protect them from potential negative attention, but mostly because their lack of understanding about my work made their participation feel complicated and potentially awkward. "I told him I would check with you about arrangements," Rebecca replied diplomatically. "The venue can accommodate additional guests, and frankly, having family support visible during the announcement could be good optics. But obviously that's your decision to make." Her political instincts were sound, but she also understood the complex family dynamics that made this decision more complicated than simple campaign strategy. I considered the implications of having my parents present when I officially became governor-elect of Ohio. imagining my father's expression as he finally grasped the full magnitude of what I had achieved while he was criticizing my career choices. The prospect was simultaneously appealing and terrifying, offering an opportunity for validation but also creating potential for new complications in our already strained relationship. Call him back, I decided. Tell him they're welcome to attend, but warn him that it will be a media circus. If they're comfortable with that level of attention, I'd like to have them there. The decision felt right despite my nervousness about mixing family dynamics with political theater, and I realized that part of my desire for their presence came from wanting them to witness this moment of professional triumph firsthand. The press conference was scheduled for 9 o'clock at the State House, in the same rotunda where I had spent countless hours over the past 8 years working on legislation and policy initiatives. The irony of returning to announce my election as the state's chief executive wasn't lost on me, and I felt a deep satisfaction in the circular journey from staff member to elected leader within the same governmental structure. Rebecca drove us downtown through Columbus traffic that seemed heavier than usual, though I suspected my heightened awareness was making everything feel more intense and significant. The State House appeared unchanged from the outside, its limestone facade and classical columns projecting the same sense of permanence and authority that had impressed me during my first visit as a young legislative aide years earlier. But today I would enter as governor-elect, with constitutional authority and public mandate that transformed my relationship to this building and everything it represented. Camera crews were already assembling in the rotunda when we arrived, their equipment creating an electronic forest of tripods and cables that would carry news of our victory across the state and beyond. Political reporters I recognized from years of briefings and background conversations nodded professionally as I passed, their familiar faces reassuring in the midst of an otherwise surreal experience. "Governor-elect Wilson," one reporter called out, testing the title that would soon become official. The words sent a thrill through me that I tried to suppress, knowing that showing too much excitement might undermine the gravitas expected of someone assuming executive responsibility. But privately, I marveled at how those 2 words validated years of work and sacrifice while opening doors to possibilities I had barely dared to imagine. My parents arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled announcement, looking simultaneously proud and overwhelmed by the media attention surrounding them. My father wore his best suit, a navy blue ensemble reserved for weddings and funerals, while my mother had chosen a conservative dress in burgundy that complemented her carefully styled hair. They moved through the crowd of reporters and political operatives with the cautious steps of people entering unfamiliar territory, their expressions mixing excitement with uncertainty about appropriate behavior in this formal setting. "Ella?" my mother said, softly as she reached me, her voice carrying an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "We are so proud of you. I still can't quite believe this is really happening." Her words were simple but carried weight that went beyond the immediate moment, acknowledging not just this achievement, but perhaps also the years of misunderstanding that had preceded it. My father stood slightly behind her, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching awe as he surveyed the assembled media and political figures who were treating his daughter as the center of attention. "This is incredible, Ella," he said, his voice hushed with respect for the magnitude of the occasion. "I had no idea that you were capable of something like this." The comment stung slightly, highlighting how little he had understood about my abilities and ambitions, but his obvious pride tempered any hurt feelings. "Thank you both for coming," I replied, genuinely moved by their presence despite the complicated emotions it evoked. "This means more to me than you know." The statement was true but incomplete, unable to capture the complex mixture of vindication, relief, and lingering sadness that came from finally receiving family recognition for achievements they had previously dismissed or ignored. Rebecca appeared at my elbow with the practiced timing of someone skilled at managing political schedules. 2 minutes, she announced quietly, her voice barely audible above the growing noise of the assembled crowd. "Final microphone check, then we're ready to proceed." The technical details grounded me in the present moment, reminding me that this announcement was just the beginning of a much larger process of transition and governance. I took my position behind the podium that had been positioned to take advantage of the rotunda's natural acoustics and impressive architectural backdrop. The crowd quieted as cameras focused and reporters prepared to capture my first official words as governor-elect. In the front row, I could see my parents watching with expressions of rapt attention, as though they were witnessing something that required their complete focus to fully comprehend. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the marble-walled space. "I'm honored to stand before you today as the governor-elect of Ohio, chosen by voters across our state to lead us through the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead." The formal words felt both rehearsed and completely natural, representing the culmination of months of campaigning and years of preparation for this level of responsibility. The speech that followed outlined my priorities for the upcoming term, focusing on economic development initiatives, education funding reforms, and infrastructure investments that would strengthen communities throughout Ohio. I spoke about the importance of bringing state government closer to the people it served, ensuring that policy decisions reflected the real needs and concerns of families in both urban and rural areas. As I detailed specific policy proposals, I caught sight of my father's face and was struck by his expression of intense concentration. He was listening to every word with the focused attention of someone trying to understand concepts that were completely new to him, and I realized that this might be the first time he had ever heard me speak about my professional expertise, with the authority of elected office behind my words. The campaign we ran was built on the principle that effective governance requires both vision and practical experience, I continued, feeling increasingly confident as the speech progressed. For 8 years I've had the privilege of working within state government, learning how policy decisions affect real families and communities. That experience has prepared me to lead with both ambition and humility, always remembering that public service is exactly that, service to the public good. The applause that followed was respectful but enthusiastic, coming from an audience that included political allies, former colleagues, and journalists who had covered my career progression over the years. But the applause that mattered most came from my parents, who clapped with obvious pride and something approaching amazement at seeing their daughter command such respect and attention. The question and answer session that followed allowed me to demonstrate the policy expertise that had been invisible to my family, despite being central to my professional identity. Reporters asked detailed questions about budget priorities, legislative strategies, and administrative reforms, and I found myself drawing on years of experience in ways that felt completely natural despite the formal setting. "Governor-elect Wilson," asked a reporter from the Cleveland Plain Dealer, "your background in state government gives you unusual insight into the challenges of implementing policy initiatives. How will that experience shape your approach to working with the legislature?" The question offered an opportunity to highlight exactly the kind of inside knowledge that my family had never understood or valued. 8 years of working within the system has taught me that the best policies are worthless if they can't be effectively implemented, I replied. I've seen brilliant legislation fail because it wasn't designed with practical considerations in mind, and I've seen modest proposals succeed because they acknowledged political and administrative realities. My goal is to bring that understanding to the governor's office, ensuring that our initiatives are both ambitious and achievable. As I answered question after question with detailed policy knowledge and political insight, I became aware of my parents' changing expressions. They were watching me demonstrate expertise in areas they had never realized I possessed, speaking with authority about subjects they had never heard me discuss. The recognition was gradual but unmistakable, and I could see them beginning to understand not just what I had achieved but who I had become through years of dedicated work in public service. The press conference concluded with commitments to begin transition activities immediately, working with the current governor's office to ensure smooth continuity of state operations. As the crowd began to disperse, my parents remained seated in the front row, apparently overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had witnessed and uncertain about appropriate next steps. "Ella," my father said as I approached them after finishing a brief conversation with legislative leaders who had attended the announcement, "I owe you a much bigger apology than the one I offered Saturday night." His voice carried a humility I had never heard from him before, the tone of someone who had been forced to completely revise his understanding of a fundamental relationship. "Your career isn't just successful," he continued, struggling to find words adequate to his realization. "You're going to be the governor of our state. You'll be responsible for millions of people, making decisions that affect every family in Ohio. I've spent years telling you that your work didn't matter, and now I find out that you're one of the most important people in the entire state." The confession was both gratifying and painful. highlighting how completely he had misunderstood my abilities and achievements while also demonstrating his genuine shock at learning the truth. I felt sympathy for his confusion, even as I savored the vindication of finally having my accomplishments recognized by someone whose opinion had mattered to me for my entire life. "Dad," I said gently, "I didn't run for governor to prove anything to you or anyone else in the family. I did it because I believe I can make a positive difference in people's lives. But I'm glad you're beginning to understand that the work I do has value and meaning." The statement was diplomatic but honest, acknowledging his recognition while also establishing that my motivation came from internal conviction rather than external validation. My mother joined our conversation with tears in her eyes, reaching out to hug me with an intensity that spoke to years of suppressed pride and concern. "I'm so sorry we didn't see this before," she whispered. "We were so worried about you being different that we never realized you were building something extraordinary." Her apology felt more complete than my father's, acknowledging not just misunderstanding but also the emotional cost of their lack of support. As we stood together in the rotunda where I had just been introduced as governor-elect, surrounded by the marble columns and painted ceilings that represented the dignity of democratic governance, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond political achievement. The validation I had sought from my family had finally arrived, not through explanation or argument, but through the undeniable evidence of public recognition and trust. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken election to the state's highest office to convince my family that my career choices had been worthwhile. But I chose to focus on gratitude rather than resentment. They were here now, witnessing my moment of triumph and beginning to understand the path that had led to this achievement. The years of dismissal and criticism couldn't be erased, but they could be balanced by this new understanding and the possibility of building a different kind of relationship based on mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. Rebecca appeared beside us with the efficient timing that had characterized our entire working relationship. "Governor-elect," she said, the title still carrying novelty even as it began to feel natural. "Channel 6 is ready for the exclusive interview, and then we have meetings with legislative leadership scheduled for this afternoon." The rapid transition back to political business reminded me that this moment of family reconciliation was taking place within a much larger transformation that would reshape every aspect of my life. "I should go," I told my parents, though I was reluctant to end this conversation before we had fully processed its implications. "But I'd like to continue this discussion soon. Maybe you could come to Columbus for dinner this week, and we could talk about what comes next." The invitation represented a new beginning, an opportunity to build a relationship based on who we had all become, rather than who we had been during my childhood. "We'd love that," my mother replied immediately, speaking for both of them with the enthusiasm of someone eager to make up for lost time and understanding. "Just tell us when and where." My father nodded agreement, his expression still showing traces of bewilderment but also unmistakable pride in what his daughter had accomplished. As I walked toward the interview area where cameras and bright lights awaited, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from Saturday's family reunion to Monday's gubernatorial announcement. The transformation in my family's perception had been dramatic and gratifying, but it had also highlighted how little they had truly known about my professional life and personal aspirations. Moving forward, the challenge would be building authentic relationships based on mutual understanding, rather than simply basking in their newfound recognition of my achievements. 3 months later, I stood in the governor's mansion reviewing briefing materials for the next day's Economic Development Summit, when my assistant knocked on the study door. "Governor, your parents have arrived for dinner," she announced with the professional courtesy that had become routine since my inauguration. The title still sent a small thrill through me, though it had begun to feel natural as I settled into the rhythms and responsibilities of executive leadership. I walked to the mansion's main entrance where my parents waited with the slightly formal posture of people who remained somewhat awed by their surroundings despite multiple visits. The governor's mansion intimidated them in ways that my Columbus apartment never had, and I suspected they would never feel entirely comfortable in a setting that represented power and prestige so dramatically different from their small-town experience. "Mom, Dad," I greeted them warmly, embracing each in turn. "Thank you for coming. I know the drive from Millfield isn't easy on a weeknight." Their willingness to make the trip had become one of the unexpected benefits of my election, creating opportunities for regular contact that had been absent for years when they viewed my career as an inexplicable deviation from sensible life choices. My father carried a newspaper folded to display a headline about my administration's Rural Infrastructure Initiative, a program that would bring high-speed internet access to underserved communities throughout Ohio. "I've been reading about your broadband project," he said with obvious pride. "Mrs. Henderson at the bank says it might finally give Millfield access to the same internet speeds they have in Columbus. That could make a real difference for local businesses." The comment represented a dramatic shift in how he discussed my work, moving from dismissive criticism to engaged interest in policy details that affected his own community. Over the past 3 months, he had become an unlikely advocate for my administration among his friends and neighbors, explaining complex policy initiatives with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered that government work could have tangible local benefits. "The program should reach Millfield within 18 months, I confirmed, pleased to see his genuine excitement about an initiative that exemplified my approach to governance. "We're prioritizing rural communities that have been underserved by private internet providers, focusing on areas where improved connectivity will create the biggest economic opportunities." My mother had been quieter during our recent conversations, seemingly still processing the magnitude of the changes in our family dynamic. "How are you adjusting to all this?" she asked, gesturing around the mansion's elegant interior. "It must be overwhelming sometimes, having so much responsibility." Her concern was maternal rather than political, focused on my personal well-being rather than policy achievements. "Some days are definitely challenging," I admitted as we moved toward the private dining room where dinner had been prepared. "But I have excellent staff, and the work itself is exactly what I've been preparing for throughout my career. It feels like a natural progression rather than a dramatic change." The explanation was honest but incomplete, unable to capture the profound satisfaction that came from having constitutional authority to implement ideas I had been developing for years. Dinner conversation flowed more easily than I would have predicted 6 months earlier, when political topics had been sources of tension rather than connection. My parents asked informed questions about legislative priorities and seemed genuinely interested in understanding the complexities of state governance. They had clearly been educating themselves about political processes, reading newspapers and watching news programs with new attention to subjects they had previously ignored. "I saw your interview on Channel 6 last week," my father said between courses. "You handled those questions about the budget really well. Very professional." His assessment carried the tone of someone offering expert evaluation despite having no expertise in the subject, but I appreciated his effort to engage with my work on its own terms rather than simply expressing general pride. The most significant change was in their relationship with my professional identity, which they now discussed with respect and curiosity, rather than bewilderment or concern. They had begun to understand that being governor required skills and knowledge they could appreciate, even if they couldn't fully comprehend the technical details. My success had become a source of family pride rather than family worry. "There's something I wanted to discuss with both of you," I said as we finished our main course. "I've been invited to speak at the National Governors Association conference next month, and they're encouraging governors to bring family members to the reception events. I was wondering if you'd be interested in attending." The invitation represented another step in integrating my family into my public life, though I remained uncertain about their comfort level with high-profile political events. My parents exchanged glances with the rapid communication of people who had been married for decades. "We'd be honored," my mother replied without hesitation. "Though I have to admit the idea of meeting other governors and their families is a bit intimidating." Her honesty was refreshing, acknowledging both excitement and anxiety about entering political circles that remained foreign to their experience. "You'll do fine," I assured them. "Most political families are more normal than you might expect. And honestly, having you there would mean a lot to me. It would be nice to have family support at these kinds of events." The request was strategic as well as personal, knowing that visible family presence enhanced political credibility while also satisfying my own desire for their continued involvement in this new phase of my life. As dinner concluded, my father cleared his throat with the deliberate timing that usually preceded serious conversation. "Ella, I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to run it by you." His tone suggested careful consideration of whatever he was about to propose. "I've been talking to some folks around Millfield about your policies and your background. helping them understand what you're trying to accomplish as governor. The revelation surprised me, imagining my father discussing policy initiatives with his auto parts customers and golf partners. "What kind of conversations have you been having?" I asked, curious about how he was representing my work to people who shared his previous skepticism about government careers. "Well, people know you're from Millfield, and they have questions about whether you understand small-town concerns," he explained. "I've been telling them about your rural development programs and explaining how your experience in state government actually helps you design policies that work for communities like ours." His description painted a picture of informal advocacy that was both touching and politically valuable. "I was wondering," he continued, "if you might consider visiting Millfield officially sometime. Maybe hold a town hall meeting or something like that. I think it would help people see that you haven't forgotten where you came from, and it might be good for your political standing to show support in your hometown." The suggestion was astute, recognizing both local interests and broader political considerations. The proposal appealed to me on multiple levels, offering an opportunity to demonstrate state-level attention to small-town concerns while also completing the circle of my relationship with my hometown. "I think that's an excellent idea," I replied. "Let me have my staff work with Mayor Williams to plan something appropriate. Maybe we could combine a town hall with an announcement about the broadband initiative's timeline for your area." My mother smiled with obvious pleasure at this prospect. The whole town would be so excited to have the governor visit officially. "People are already proud that you're from Millfield, but having you return in an official capacity would be wonderful." Her enthusiasm reflected a community pride that had apparently replaced whatever embarrassment they might have felt about my unconventional career path. As the evening concluded and my parents prepared to drive back to Millfield, I reflected on the remarkable transformation in our relationship over the past 3 months. The distance that had characterized our interactions for years had been replaced by genuine interest and mutual respect, though I remained aware that this change had been triggered by external validation rather than internal understanding. "Thank you for dinner," my father said as we stood in the mansion's foyer. "And thank you for being patient with us while we figured out what you'd accomplished. I know we were slow to understand, but we're proud of you now." His apology was simple but complete, acknowledging both past mistakes and current appreciation without making excuses for the years of misunderstanding. "I'm just glad we're here now," I replied, embracing him with genuine warmth. "The past is the past. What matters is building something better going forward." The sentiment was diplomatic but sincere, reflecting my choice to focus on possibilities rather than grievances as we navigated this new phase of our relationship. After they departed, I returned to my study to review materials for the next day's meetings, but found myself distracted by thoughts about the journey that had brought us to this point. The validation I had craved from my family had finally arrived, though it had required election to the state's highest office to convince them that my career choices had been worthwhile. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I chose to focus on gratitude rather than resentment. The phone rang, interrupting my reflections with a call from Rebecca about scheduling details for the upcoming governor's conference. As we discussed logistics and political considerations, I realized how completely my life had changed since that difficult family reunion just 6 months earlier. The woman who had stood alone at a community center, absorbing criticism about her failures, had become the governor of Ohio, with a supportive family who finally understood her worth. The transformation hadn't erased the pain of those years of dismissal, but it had created space for new relationships based on mutual respect and genuine appreciation. My parents would never fully comprehend the complexities of state governance or the intellectual satisfaction I derived from policy development, but they no longer needed to understand everything in order to support my choices and celebrate my achievements. As I prepared for bed in the mansion that had become my temporary home, I thought about the upcoming town hall in Millfield and the opportunity it would represent to demonstrate how far I had traveled while remaining connected to my roots. The girl who had left small-town Ohio to pursue her ambitions in state government would return as governor, bringing resources and attention that could benefit the community that had shaped her. The circle would be complete, but it would also be the beginning of something new, a relationship with my family and hometown based on who I had become rather than who I had been, grounded in achievement rather than potential, built on respect rather than hope. The validation had finally arrived, and with it, the freedom to move forward without the weight of seeking approval from those who had been slowest to recognize my worth. The next morning would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight I allowed myself to savor the satisfaction of having proven that the path I had chosen, despite its unconventional nature and years of family skepticism, had led exactly where I had always believed it could. To a position where I could serve the public good while finally earning the recognition and respect that had eluded me for so long. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.